So I thought I'd go with the classic rule of show, don't tell. The first thing we all learn in any creative writing class. But maybe some of you still struggle with this or don't even know how to spot it in your manuscript. In this video, I'll show you how to search for those indicators in your manuscript, along with some tips on how to fix it. Now, these are just things that I've learned that have helped me in my writing, but they are by no means rules you have to follow. In fact, there's really no rules in fiction at all. And you might not even agree with what I have to say, and that's totally cool. But I would love to hear what your techniques are and what you do to show, not tell, or any other writing tips that you have. Please leave them in the comments below. We're all writers here, so we should learn together and share our experience. All right, so our topic is show, don't tell. But what does that actually mean? Well, according to Wikipedia, which proved to be pretty accurate, it's a technique used in various kinds of texts to allow the reader to experience the story through action, words, thoughts, senses, and feelings, rather than through the author's exposition, summarization, and description. It avoids adjectives describing the author's analysis, but instead describes the scene in such a way that the reader can draw to his or her own conclusion. Okay, so we've heard this a million times, but I still find myself telling rather than showing in important moments. So this is how I spot for it in my manuscript and how I fix it. So during my first draft, I just try to be aware of this mistake and avoid it as much as possible, so it's less rewriting later on, but I'll never go back and reread or try to look for it or spot for it until the novel's finished. Otherwise, let's be honest, we would never finish the novel. So this is something I look for during my character draft, which usually ends up being about the third pass through on the manuscript or the third draft. And then that way I can make sure that my characters are showing their emotions through body language or action, and not just telling the reader. So some indicators to look for are adverbs. A lot of times when we're using adverbs, we're telling the reader rather than showing them. According to Stephen King, on his book on writing, he describes adverbs as, with adverbs, the writer is usually telling us he or she is afraid. He or she isn't expressing him or herself clearly, and that he or she is not getting the point across the picture. So let's take a look at some examples of this. John looked at Jane sadly. The word sadly doesn't really evoke any kind of emotion on the page. Instead, show the reader how a sad person would look at another. John closed his eyes and held back his tears before opening them to look at Jane. Here, we see John sad because he's holding back tears. Showing a character's emotion has way more of an impact for the reader than telling them they're sad or whatever they're feeling. So when I'm ready to look for this, I'll go through my manuscript and highlight every time I used an adverb or just flat out stated the character's emotion. And instead, I'll replace it by showing the character's emotion and getting rid of that adverb. Another thing to look for is anytime you use the words was or were, and try to replace those with active verbs. Don't just say he was running when you could say he bolted, he raced, he sprinted, he dashed. Another area you may want to check for in your manuscript for signs of telling and not showing is anytime you are dealing with your setting or world building. If you just flat out state that it was freezing, I don't really feel anything. But if you tell me that that character is shivering, unable to talk or move, ice is stuck in their beard or on the tip of their nose, then you've convinced me that it's freezing and that that person is cold. Or if it's nighttime, don't just tell me the moon's out. Show me how it's shining and how that character perceives it, what it means to them. A great way to make sure that you are showing the reader and not telling them is to utilize all 5 senses. So to check for this, I'll go through my manuscript and highlight every time I use one of those senses, along with what it was. Sometimes I find that I'm only using sight and not enough smell, or that my character hasn't felt or tasted anything in days. So it's a good way to go through and highlight that so you can make sure you are using all 5 senses. Typically, I try to have every 3 to 5 pages that I'm using all 5 of those senses. Action and body language is another way to show the character's emotion and a great way to build character development. Maybe your character has a tic that they do when they're nervous or lying, or maybe they stand in a certain position that makes them stand out in a crowd. Or they could have an emotional outburst and throw a chair and act rash. So whatever you decide to do, just make sure your character is moving and expressing their emotion through body language that separates them from others and reflects their own personality. These things are going to make your character appear more human on the page. Dialogue is another tool you can use to show the reader rather than telling them. Don't just say, my dad was mad. Show the dad lashing out. Get back in this house this instant. Or maybe your character slurs or stutters their words. Whatever it is, dialogue is a great way to show that your characters are unique. After all, it's them speaking, and it should sound like themselves. But be cautious not to use dialogue to tell the readers something that would have been better shown. Otherwise, they might get pulled out of the story if your character isn't talking like a normal person or isn't sounding like themselves. Thoughts and feelings are another area you might want to check for showing and not telling. Sometimes we have no choice when it comes to internal dialogue. We just have to flat out say what the character's thinking or feeling, especially if it ties in with a plot point or some future event to take place. But highlight those areas and see if they would have more impact if you could show it. And you'll have to kind of decide that on your own, but sometimes you have no choice and just have to flat out state it when it comes to internal dialogue. So internal dialogue or narrative is when we get a look inside that character's head, and which is why almost always books are better than movies. We get to see what makes them tick, what they're most scared of, what motivates them. We get that private look inside their head, which really bonds us to the character. But ask yourself, would those thoughts or feelings be better shown on the page or be better as internal dialogue? And for my last tip that I'll suggest that you use is to use specific nouns and clear adjectives in your descriptions. You want to paint that image in their head. Don't just say, I smelled grandma's pie. Say, I smelled grandma's apple-baked cinnamon pie. So to overview everything that we talked about, some of the areas that you may want to check for showing and not telling are adverbs, character emotion, action and body language, dialogue, thoughts and feelings, using all 5 senses, using strong and active verbs, using specific nouns and clear adjectives, setting and world building, internal dialogue or narrative. Well, that is it for us today. Thank you so much for joining me, and I hope you at least learned one new thing about showing and not telling. And if there's anything I missed or something you want to add, please leave them in the comments below. I would love to hear from you.